Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom, Scholem. We are continuing Hasidism in medieval Germany. Think of the knights who go to war and do not flee before the sword, for they are ashamed to flee, and so as not to expose themselves to shame, as they let themselves be killed or wounded, and they receive no reward from their masters for their death in battle. Thus, let him speak with the scripture. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, and I will serve him without hope of reward. According to Simhoni, the legend which ascribes to Jehuda the Hasid an unsuccessful attempt before his death to unravel the date of the end is typical of the belated efforts to represent Hasidism as more messianic than it really was. But it is possible to accept this fundamentally anti-eschatological interpretation of Hasidism. It is not borne out even by the Book of the Devout, far less by the other documents of this group, such as, for example, the writings of Eleazar of Worms. If it is true that their religious interest does not center on the messianic promise in the strict sense, it is no less true that the imagination of these writers is powerfully affected by everything which concerns the eschatology of the soul. The whole subject was of less direct interest to the apocalyptically inclined Merkaba mystics than to the older visionaries like the author of the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, but it was studied in other circles and inspired several of the shorter midrashim. Eschatological ideas concerning the nature of the state of bliss in paradise, the dawn of redemption, the nature of resurrection, the beatific vision of the just, their bodies and garments, the problem of reward and punishment, etc., were of real importance to a man like Yehuda the Hasid. Because they didn't say it as a J sound, did they say it as a right? These notions were by no means literary ballast, carried along with many traditions of a different kind. Indeed, they belong to the very heart and core of the religious faith of these men, which manifested itself in so many different ways. Many were, no doubt, the spontaneous creation of the age, but even those which came from the East in the wake of the eschatological Agadah, such as the description of the terrors of the judgment held in the grave itself in the first days after burial, Hebut ha-Kever, were eagerly taken up and embellished. At all times, the vagueness of eschatological hopes, the contents of which have not been dogmatically defined, has evoked more interest among the common people than some great Jewish theologians have been willing to allow. For Yehuda the Hasid, mysticism represents something like an anticipation of a knowledge which, strictly speaking, belongs to messianic times. There are secrets which are revealed in the upper world and which are preserved there for the time to come. Only the mystics and the allegorists of this world absorb something of the odor of these secrets and mysteries, notwithstanding which there can be no doubt that speculations concerning the end never cease to play a part in Hasidic mysticism. The scope and variety of Hasidic speculation is far greater than that of the old Merkaba mysticism. In addition to the latter's favorite subjects of meditation, it introduces a species of mystical thought on a number of new subjects. Thus we find a new theosophy, the mystery of God's unity, which, without entirely abandoning the old mysticism of the throne, goes far beyond it and forms a special branch of mystical doctrine, a new mystical psychology conceived as an instrument of this theosophy, and extensive speculation concerning the reasons of the Torah, i.e., above all, the true motives of the commandments, a subject which the old Agadah, no less than many of the Merkaba mystics, expressly reserved for messianic times. Thus, while the ecstatic Merkaba vision, as we have seen, left little room for exegetical speculation, such speculation, whatever its forms or methods, and some of them were strange indeed, occupies a highly important place in the religious thought of the Hasidim. Should I say Hasidim? Nor is this all. The Hasidic doctrine includes, in addition to a social philosophy based on the conception of natural right and probably derived from Christian sources, something like a rudimentary theology of history. According to Eliezer of Worms, there have been since the days of creation historical forces of opposition, weeds as he calls them, which counteract the divine purpose. And in Ekankar, that's what they call the members that aren't living up to their initiations. Then why do they keep getting their initiations? Oh, well, how do you explain that? If it's only the worthy and the selected by the leader. The verse, Genesis 3:18, thorns and thistles shall the earth bring forth to thee, is to be understood not only in a natural, but also in a historical sense, the earth signifying in this context the stage on which man's history is enacted. Thorns and thistles are interpreted by a process of reasoning based on numerological mysticism as representations of the profane history which in every generation stands in opposition to the inner sacred historical process. The origin of profane history is sought in the fall, which is also defined as a cause of force and social inequality in the relations of men. But for Adam's fall, man would have continuous concourse with the angels and maintain a permanent relationship with God based on direct revelation. And even after the fall, men might have avoided the division into rich and poor, the evil social inequality, if they all had remained tillers of the soil. The point to be stressed here is the fact that side by side with theosophical speculation concerning the mysteries of the Creator and the creation, Hasidism gives prominence, far more than does Merkaba mysticism, to ideas which are of the direct concern to the religious existence of man. It sets up a definite human ideal, a type of man, and a way of life to be followed, and includes among the main articles of its mystical faith, in addition to a peculiar form of mystical prayer, the idea of Hasiduth, of which a fuller account must now be given. We're into part 4 here. Neither learning nor tradition of any kind are among the prime motive forces of Hasidism. What gave to the movement its distinctive character was, more than any other, its novel conception of the devout. The Hasid is a religious ideal which transcends all values derived from the intellectual sphere, and the realization of which was considered more desirable than any intellectual accomplishment. To be a Hasid is to conform to purely religious standards, entirely independent of intellectualism and learning. The surprise expressed by Gudeman that the term Hasid was often used of devout but otherwise not remarkable men reveals a significant inability, doubly remarkable in the case of so eminent a scholar, to appreciate a scale of values completely independent of the traditional Jewish veneration for the learned student of the Torah. 4. While Hasidism continued to place a premium on knowledge, it was nevertheless possible to be a Hasid without an understanding of more than that, say, of the text of the Bible. It is significant that the Psalm reader became a figure of Hasidic legend. It is owing to him that an entire community is able to resist the great persecutions in the years of the Black Death. 2 is when it ended, and 1348 is when it started, in the Common Era. It is more than unlikely that such legends could have arisen in Spain. They could flourish only because the ground had been prepared by a new conception of ideal humanity. The Hasid is remarkable not by any intellectual standard of values, but only within the categorical framework of Hasiduth itself. The word Hasid has a specific meaning which is sharply distinguished from the much more vague and general significance of the same term in Talmudic usage. 3 things above all others go to make the true Hasid as he appears before us in the Book of the Devout: ascetic renunciation of the things of this world, complete serenity of mind, and an altruism grounded in principle and driven to extremes. Let us consider these points a little closer. The ascetic turn of mind is the corollary of a darkly pessimistic attitude towards life, a characteristic expression which may be found in the interpretation given to an old midrash by Eliezer of Worms. The midrash on the creation of the child relates that after its guardian angel has given it a fillip upon the nose, a newborn child forgets all the infinite knowledge acquired before its birth in the celestial houses of learning. But why, Eliezer asks, does the child forget? Because if it did not forget, the course of this world would drive it to madness if it thought about it in the light of what it knew. Truly a remarkable variant of the Platonic conception of cognition as a recollection, an amnesis which lies also in the root of this midrash. For this doctrine, hope is present only in the eschatological perspective, as Eliezer put it in a somewhat drastic metaphor. Man is a rope whose two ends are pulled by God and Satan, and in the end God proves stronger. In practice, this asceticism joins the renunciation of profane speech, of playing with children, and of other innocent pleasures. He who keeps birds only for ornament would do better to give the money to the poor. In short, it amounts to turning one's back on ordinary life, as lived by ordinary people, as a Voth Derek Eretz, to quote the pregnant term used in the Book of the Devout. The Hasid must resolutely reject and overcome every temptation of ordinary life. By natural corollary, this asceticism finds its antithesis in a magnified eschatological hope and promise. By renouncing the temptations of this world, by averting his eyes from women, he becomes worthy of an afterlife in which he will see the glory of the Shekinah with his own eyes and rank above the angels. Secondly, the Hasid must bear insults and shame without flinching, and indeed the very term Hasid is interpreted with the aid of an ingenious play of words as one who bears shame, for to bear shame and derision is an essential part of the way of the true devotee. In fact, the Hasid proves himself worthy of his name precisely in such situations. Though he be insulted and pale with shame, yet he remains deaf and dumb. For even though his face is now pale, Isaiah has already said, or at least the person writing Isaiah 29, verse 22, neither shall his face now wax pale, for indeed his face shall be radiant hereafter. When the psalmist says, for thy sake are we killed all the day long, he means those who bear shame and dishonor and humiliation in carrying out his commands. This constantly stressed imperviousness to the scorn and mockery which the Hasid's way of life cannot fail to evoke by its extremism, is the true imitation of God. He, the ideal of the Hasid, is meant by the prophet when he says, Isaiah 42:14, I have long time holden my peace, I have been still and refrained myself. Here again the hope of eternal bliss is the predominant note, although, as we have seen, it is occasionally emphasized that this hope should not be the motive of one's actions. One abused and insulted a Hasid. The latter did not mind while the other called down curses on his body and his possessions, but when he cursed him by saying he wished him many sins, so that he might lose his share of eternal bliss, that grieved him. When his disciples questioned him about it, he replied, when he called me names, he could not wound me. I need no honor, for when a man dies, what becomes of his honor? But when he called curses down on my blessedness, then I began to fear that he might bring me to sin. No stress is laid on the third point. The essence of Hasiduth is to act in all things not on, but within the line of strict justice, that is to say, not to insult one's own interest on the letter of the Torah, for it is said of God, whom the Hasid strives to follow, Psalm 95:17. Oh, wait, no, sorry. Psalm 145:17. The Lord is Hasid in all his ways. This altruism is stressed already in the sayings of the fathers. An ethical Mishnah treatise. What is mine is yours, and what is yours is yours. That is the way of the Hasid. The famous commentator Rashi too repeatedly lays emphasis on the fact that the Hasid does not insist on the letter of the law, even though it may be to his advantage to do so. There can be little doubt the formulation of this principle in the Sefer Hasidim only partially bridges the divergence between the way of life and the normative canon of rabbinical Judaism. The Halakha. On the side of the Hasidim, there was the ancient Talmudic tradition of a special Mishnah of the Hasidim, whose commandments place far heavier demands upon the Hasid than the ordinary standards of common law. Now, if you look at one of the secrets of the revealed, inspired part of the religion, or at least what's represented as that, is that it goes beyond the mere letter. So, but that doesn't mean that, you're doing anything, you're putting the interpretation first. No, you're interpreting in a way that it's bigger than that. Like I personally believe in 5 rules for consumption. And of those 5 rules, it's very expansive, particularly a couple of them. Because the very couple words that people are going to say, well, the one example of the one and the one example of the other. And it's like, well, it's beyond that. And really, except for when you go into the wholesome, which I guess is the 6th rule of eating, it really covers everything you're going to do with your diet. Not that you're not going to be sufficient if you follow some basic, simple interpretation, Tendencies of this kind appear only sporadically in Talmudic literature and have never been systemized. Nevertheless, they could have been used as a legitimation of those ideas of medieval Hasidism, which were indirectly derived from contemporary religious movements. In the Book of the Devout, we find what amounts to almost a crystallization of this hitherto amorphous Mishnah of the Hasidim, the heavenly law, Din Shemayim, as conceived by the Hasid, i.e. the call to self-abnegation and altruism, in many instances goes far beyond the common law of the Torah, as interpreted by the Halakha. It is not difficult to perceive the latent antagonism between the two conceptions. There are things chiefly concerning social relations which are permitted under rabbinical law, but for which heaven nevertheless inflicts punishment. As Barr has pointed out, this divergence between the law of the Torah and the heavenly law, the latter frequently used as a synonym for natural and humane fairness and equity, is a fundamental principle of the conception of morality outlined in the Sefer Hasidim. It is even made the criterion of what shall be considered right and just in everyday life. True, even this higher law, which is considered binding only for the Hasid, and which is set up in somewhat veiled opposition to the Halakha, is capable of exegetical deduction from Scripture, an undertaking in which the author of the book displays considerable ingenuity. But it is plain that anyone who proceeds from such assumptions can hardly be productive in the domain of strict halakha. However much veneration he may show for halakhic tradition, and however little he may feel inclined to adopt a revolutionary attitude towards it, and in fact we possess hardly a single new halakha from Yehuda the Hasid, in striking contrast to his productive influence in so many other fields. In the great halakhic work, Or Zarua, written by his disciple, Isaac ben Moses of Vienna, who was with him in Regensburg during the last years of his life, not one halakha is introduced in the name of his master. What he does attribute to him are miracle stories, exegetical commentaries, and original deductions and opinions, such as there are by the hundred, and most of them taken no doubt from Yehuda in the Book of the Devout. The Hasid, who in his outward behavior submits to the established law in all its rigor, at bottom denies its absolute validity for himself. Well, perhaps that's overstating it, but it is a little paradoxical when Eliezer of Worms, at the outset of his Sefer Rokeah, in which he gives an outline of the religious law, makes an attempt to codify a Hasidic ideal in halakhic terms. It is a remarkable fact that both Maimonides and his younger contemporary Eliezer prefaced their codifications of the law by attempts to extend the halakha to matters which, strictly speaking, lie beyond its province. In the case of Maimonides, a philosophic and cosmologic preface in which the ideas of Aristotelian enlightenment are introduced as elements of the halakha. In the case of Eliezer, a chapter devoted to the entirely unintellectual principles of Hasidut, the coincidence is hardly fortuitous and throws an interesting light on the significance of the various religious trends in Judaism, nor is it fortuitous that in both cases the attempts failed. The halakha was never organically linked with the quasi-halakha which preceded it. Part 5. Such Hasidut leads man to the pinnacles of true fear and love of God. In its sublimest manifestations, pure fear of God is identical with love and devotion for Him, not from a need for protection against the demons or from fear of temptation, but because in this mystical state a flood of joy enters the soul and sweeps away every trace of mundane and egotistical feeling. The soul is full of love of God and bound with ropes of love, in joy and lightness of heart. He is not like one who serves his master unwillingly, but even when one tries to hinder him, the love of service burns in his heart, and he is glad to fulfill the will of his Creator. For when the soul thinks deeply about the fear of God, then the flames of heartfelt love burst in it, and the exaltation of innermost joy fills the heart, and the lover thinks not of his advantage in the world. He does not care about the pleasures of his wife or of his sons and daughters, but all this is as nothing to him, everything except that he may do the will of his Creator, do good unto others, keep sanctified the name of God, and all the contemplation of his thoughts burns in the fire of love for Him. It is characteristic of this stage that the fulfillment of the divine will becomes purely an act of love, as in the contemporaneous Christian mystical love poetry. The relation of the mystic to God is described in terms of erotic passion, not infrequently in a way which shocks our modern sensibilities. The use of such metaphors goes back to the exhaustive treatment of the subject in Sa'adia's Theology Magnum Opus. The earthly love, which he describes in considerable detail, was for the early German Hasidism a complete allegory of the heavenly passion, just as it was in a later age for Israel. Baal Shem, the founder of Polish Hasidism, who was quoted as saying, "What Sa'adia says of love makes it possible to draw an inference from the nature of the sensual to that of the spiritual passion. If the force of sensual love is so great, how great must be the passion with which man loves God." And it's interesting that the Baal Shem Tov is known by the abbreviation Besht, which in the language of Tanakh, which, even in the early years of Christianity was known as Aramea, and 1,000 years before, 1,500 years before, still known as Aramea. Besht means shame, but I think it means something different in Hebrew, so yeah. So in there's a lot of that. The medieval and onwards language of Hebrew sometimes has opposite meanings. Anyways, the mystical principles of this Hasidut, which culminate in pure love of God, are necessary for the understanding of theosophy and of what is here called Merkabah mysticism, and it is as such prerequisites that they are introduced by Eliezer of Worms. It is clear this idea of the Hasidic devotee, an idea which bears none of the traces of scholarly gravity that may be expected in a center of Talmudic learning like Mediaeval Germany, is closely related to the ascetic ideal of the monk and particularly to its most archaic traits. Its practical message is indistinguishable from ataraxy, the presence of passion, of the Cynics and Stoics, an ideal which, although originally not conceived from religious motives, powerfully affected the nascent asceticism of Christianity and at a later period the way of life of the ancient Muslim mystics, the Sufis. What we have before us in these writings is a Judaized version of Cynicism, which makes use of cognitive tendencies in the Talmudic tradition, but regulates to the background or eliminates altogether those elements which did not fall into line with these tendencies. The influence of cynicism is obvious in the ideal of complete indifference to praise or blame, which very often in the history of mysticism figures as a sine qua non of mystical illumination, not least in the writings of the Kabbalists. The point is well brought out in the following anecdote told by the Spanish Kabbalist Isaac of Acre around 1300 of the Common Era. He who is vouchsafed the entry into the mystery of the adhesion to God, Devakuth, attains to the mystery of equanimity. He who possesses the equanimity attains to loneliness, and from there he comes to the Holy Spirit and to prophecy. And of course, Holy Spirit doesn't mean the same thing to a Jew or anything resembling a monotheist that it would resemble, that it does to a Christian. But about the mystery of equanimity, the following is told to me by Rabbi Abner. Once upon a time, a lover of secret lore came unto an anchorite, and asked to be admitted as a pupil. Then he said to him, "My son, your purpose is admirable, but do you possess equanimity or no?" He replied, "Indeed, I feel satisfaction at praise and pain at insult, but I am not revengeful, and I bear no grudge." Then the master said to him, "My son, go back to your home, for as long as you have no equanimity and can still feel the sting of an insult, you have not attained to the state where you can connect your thoughts with God." There is nothing in this Kabbalistic or Sufic anecdote which is not entirely in harmony with the spirit of Hasidism. Very similar ideas have been expressed at the same time by the German mystic Meister Eckhart, who quotes the old, i.e., the Stoics, as his authority. Another element of cynicism is evident in the way in which the practice of certain actions is carried to extremes, and the whole moral and religious fervor of the mind concentrated on a single aspect of religious life or on a single moral quality. Already the old paraphrase of Sa'adia, through which, as we have seen, numerous religious ideas were transmitted to these circles, defines the Hasid as one who all his life devotes himself to one particular religious commandment to which he stays obedient under any circumstances, even though he may be inconsistent in fulfilling other commandments. But one who wavers from one day to another between the various commandments is not called a Hasid. Here the element of radicalism and extremism, which later on Maimonides too regarded as characteristic of the Hasid, appears already in the definition of the term. On the other hand, the element of indifference to praise or blame, the ideal of ataraxy, which stands in such striking contrast to this religious radicalism, is now nowhere referred to in the theological sources of Hasidism and must have come from outside, that is to say, probably from the Christian environment. Both are equally essential, for this is the paradoxical combination of these two spiritual qualities which makes the cynic, and it is the ideal of the monkish cynic which appears before us in a Jewish guise under the name of Hasidism, generally accepted as the moral ideal by contemporary Christian society, glorified by saints, popular preachers, and tract writers. It struck roots among the German Jews in the atmosphere created by the Crusades. The innumerable little stories in which the Hasidic ideal is developed in the Book of the Devout have a close counterpart in the collections of those examples which Christian preachers were in the habit of introducing in their homilies. Alongside a mass of folklore, these contain not a few stories of profound moral interest, thoughts common to the mystics of every religion, and which might have grown out of any one of them. Such tales travel fast and know no boundaries. A story such as that of the devout man who bears the odium of apparent depravity and lives among whores and gamblers in order to try to save them from at least one sin is cosmopolitan in its appeal. For the old Merkabah mystics, the devotee, as we have seen, was at best the keeper of holy mysteries. This conception differs radically from that of the Hasidim, for whom humility, restraint, and self-abnegation rank higher than the pride of heart, which fills the Merkabah visionary in the mystical presence of God. The place of the ecstatic seer, whose mystical alam carries him across all barriers and hindrances to the steps of the heavenly throne, is taken by the meditative devotee, sunk in humble contemplation of the omnipresent infinite. However, this ideal of the purely contemplative mystic must be understood in its true religious and social context. The Hasid, whose face is, as it were, turned towards God and away from the community, nevertheless functions as the latter's true guide and master. The guiding function appears very clearly in the manner in which Hasidic literature is at pains to make allowances for human weakness and to show every consideration for the conditions of life of the community. The moral casuistry of the Book of the Devout, in which this respect goes far beyond the older halakhic literature in its earthbound realism, is a precious document of true humanity. For all moral and religious radicalism of its demands upon the devout, Hasidism does not hesitate to condemn the ostentatious display of those qualities at which the Talmud already called heedless or absurd devotion. Its monkish character is also apparent in the quiet assumption that not everybody is destined to be a Hasid. Both Yehuda the Hasid and his father are pictured by the legend as saints in whom both aspects of this form of religious life were harmoniously combined: radical, antisocial, introspective devotion to the ideal, and loving care for the maintenance of the community. Now, you don't have to be antisocial to go beyond the social, just not a sociopath, right? To this trait must be added another: the helpless, selfless, indifferent Hasid figures in the minds of a public influenced by Hasidism as an enormously powerful being who can command the forces of all elements. Here the popular conception of the true Hasids supplements the picture which the Hasidim have drawn out of themselves, though not without causing some discrepancies. To take one example, Yehuda the Hasid, although fully convinced of the effectiveness of magic and other occult disciplines, was sharply opposed to their practice. He appears to have sensed very clearly the contrast between the magician who prides himself on his control of the elements and the humble Hasid who craves no form of power, but his perception of the danger did not prevent the magical elements in his heritage from gaining the upper hand over his moral ideal. In the legend, he appears as the bearer and dispenser of all those magical powers and attributes which he was at such pains to renounce. But this legend is by no means the product of later generations. It began to form already during his lifetime. In this conception, the Hasid appears as the true master of magical forces who can obtain everything precisely because he wants nothing for himself. Nowhere else in Judaism has man, the magical creator, been surrounded with such a halo. It is to Hasidism that we owe the development of the legend of the Golem, or magical homunculus. This quintessential product of the spirit of German Jewry and the theoretical foundations of this magical doctrine in the writings of Eliezer of Worms, the most faithful of Yehuda's disciples. Discourses on the essence of Hasiduth are to be found side by side with tracts on magic and the effectiveness of God's secret names, and in one case even in the same book. There one also finds the oldest excellent recipes for creating the golem, a mixture of letter magic and practices obviously aimed at producing ecstatic states of consciousness. It would appear as though the original conception of the golem came to life